Good trial run. Good job, everyone.
Solid take two, check.
Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. So glad to join you this week for discussion of government and politics in Oklahoma. Joining me, as always, are both of my wonderful co-hosts, Bailey Perkins. Hello, Bailey.
Hello, Andy. Happy Friday, listeners.
And Dr. Scott Melson. Hello, sir.
What is up?
What's up? All right. Well, let's get into it. Last week, thanks for all of you who listened to my very brief episode where I just read headlines basically for 15 minutes because it was a busy week. The legislature adjourned sine die, which of course means that they settled on a budget as well. And joining us later in this episode will be Paul Shinn and his colleague Emma from OK Policy to discuss the budget and where it ended up. But before that, let's talk about some of the other things that have happened now over the last 2 weeks. And let's start with, I think, a topic that we could and should in the future spend an entire episode or month on, and that is the Tulsa Race Massacre. Last week was the 100th anniversary. Anniversary feels celebratory, and this is not a thing to be celebrated. Remembrance, that's a good word. Thank you. And there were events all week last week, including President Biden coming to the state, which is not a frequent occurrence for Oklahoma. And so there's a lot of stuff going on. I hope, listeners, that some of you got a chance to watch the various live streams or specials that were on PBS and the History Channel. Yesterday, the Massacre Centennial Commission held a National Day of Learning that had a bunch of really great workshops. I will put the link to that in the chat because they had some really good discussions that I got to listen in on. Bailey, you did something with the Oklahoman related to the massacre, right?
Yes. So Clyde Bunyan is leading the charge for the Oklahoman, for the opinion sections, for diversity efforts and other things from the newspaper standpoint. And they did a series of articles as well as features on their podcast. And one of the features for the podcast was an excerpt from survival eyewitness accounts. And so I had the honor of bringing to life the words from Mary Parrish Jones's book, where she talked about the Tulsa Race Massacre as a survivor from that tragic time in our state and nation's history. And so I read how devastating it was and how bodies were dragged from vehicles. She talked about buildings and homes being set on fire, the smell of smoke and other things in the communities, and how so much devastation occurred on those couple of days. And so we also discussed what that means for today, 100 years later. And so we talked about the implications from a policy standpoint, because 100 years later, there's still no reparation or restitution for the survivors, because there are 3 survivors who are still with us today, a century later, as well as their descendants who should have been inheritors of land and the wealth of the businesses that were thriving and other things that were denied the survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so that was the goal of and then also one important piece from the Oklahomans coverage is talking about its role in perpetuating revisionism about the Tulsa Race Massacre and how their coverage a century ago caused harm to Black communities, and particularly the Greenwood area. And so under Clyde's leadership, the Oklahoman was having that internal reflection of what it can better do to, and its responsibility of sharing accurate coverage and lifting ethical stories, right? And so I was honored to be a part of that. So you can just Google the Oklahoman podcast and that information will pop up. They also included stories from Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, who was deeply involved in the Tulsa Race Massacre Legacy Fest. She testified on Capitol Hill, I think about a week or two prior to the Tulsa Race Massacre remembrance, alongside survivors who are still with us. And they testified, I can't remember which committee, I think it was related to civil rights, but they got to talk to Congress about how Tulsa continues to be impacted by the decisions that were made in 1921. So,
yeah, I would just add two things to everything that you just said, Bailey, that I think are one thing that's worth doing. So I was not able to go to Tulsa and attend any of the events. I wish that I could have. But like a lot of people, I knew that the race massacre happened. I mean, it got a mention in my, I knew that something that at the time was called the race riot, the Tulsa race riot, had happened in, a long time ago in Tulsa. That was honestly about the extent that I knew of it. And, maybe I learned more in school and it didn't take. That's entirely possible. But like many people, I have learned a lot more recently as we've approached the centennial, as our country and our communities have been having a lot more conversations around race and racism and what that looks like in America's, both in our history and in our present. I've learned more about it, but I still, I still had and still have a lot to learn. I did watch last weekend Tulsa Burning, which is the History Channel special that was produced by Russell Westbrook on the race massacre and like the events that led up to it and what happened and what kind of has gone on, like kind of what some of the after effects are. I'm not saying that is or should be your like sole resource to learn about what happened, but if you're like me and really just have kind of a dearth of knowledge about it, I think that's a great place to start. So I would recommend that to anybody. About 2 hours long and just really, really powerful storytelling with interviews with survivors, and it's just very it's just very somber, but I think very well done. So that's the first thing I was going to say. Second thing is sometimes there are things where good policy is bad politics, and sometimes there is like bad policy that is good politics, but sometimes bad policy and bad politics like align. And I don't know, man. I just am a little shocked. I mean, maybe I shouldn't be, at least how, to my mind, how badly I feel like Mayor Bynum in particular has handled a lot of the comments around this and like discussions of, whether you want to call it restitution or reparations or like whatever, compensation. Just, I mean, not to make it like about politics, but that's kind of like what we talk about here. Like, I've just been struck at like a couple of his comments this week that really just hit me as like beyond tone deaf, but like, I don't know. I don't know if anybody else has had that reaction, if you guys have had that reaction to some of his things that he said or not, but I've thought a lot about that this week and just thinking, man, like, is this really how like some of our elected leaders, including a guy that I have thought of as being like fairly like kind of moderate and like reasonable, and you know what I mean, like a guy that I think is trying to move his city forward. It just, I mean, it was just very striking to me, some of the things that I heard him say this week.
Well, and I mentioned this on Twitter, that the problem with having surface level conversations about race, or not having those nuanced perspectives on race, leads us to the ideas that a group of people should not be responsible for the sins of the past, right? At the surface, that seems like it's a rational, common sense statement. But when you look at the interconnectedness of who benefits from Tulsa 100 years ago and today, and then who is harmed by what happened in Tulsa 100 years ago and today, we see that there's still intersections of benefit from white Tulsans and harm for Black Tulsans, right? And it's why, like, to me, like, connecting the dots on like House Bill 1775, like banning those tough conversations on race, those intricate conversations that help us understand how power and how policy and how structural racism all intertwines into building inequities today, gets us to the ideas of Black people who are descendants from the Tulsa Race Massacre don't deserve reparations today, right? Like, you only understand how, like, because one thing that I brought up in the podcast with the Oklahoman is that when you look at what has happened over time and policy decisions, like how we built highways, and you look at major cities where most of the highways cut through are in areas that were once thriving Black communities. And we know that when you put highways through areas, it cuts off like business flow. And it makes it difficult for commerce to happen in the ways that they did, in the past. And so we saw that happen. We saw like how property values are assessed. We see food deserts. All of those things were deliberate decisions, and things that, like, those buildings were burnt to the ground. Families who owned businesses did not receive insurance claims to be able to cover those damages. Governments actively participated in the destruction of people's homes and communities and taking lives away, right? And so while Black folks had to figure out how to recover and didn't really recover after that moment, gentrification happened in those areas, right? So now there is direct benefit from what happened during that time for some groups over another. And so until governments are willing to reconcile that and bring reparations or restitutions to bring equity, we'll never get there. And so if we are just going to have the surface level conversations of we move forward on race relations by just loving each other and just having conversations with one another, then we can't get to the conversations about why the apology that the Tulsa City Council finally gave after 100 years later is not enough and doesn't scratch the surface on what needs to be done to bring equity into that community and healing.
That's exactly right. And we'll move on from this, but just imagine, listeners, that the wealthiest part of town, heck, whatever part of town you live in, doesn't have to be the wealthiest, right? This doesn't have to be Gaillardia. But what if it was that the government and a mob of your neighbors came in, burned every house in your neighborhood, and then just, killed 300 people, didn't say they're sorry, nothing happened. And then you and your neighbors slowly start trying to pick up the pieces, trying to rebuild as you can, a process that takes years. And then the government says, oh, man, these houses are crap. We're just going to tear them down and build a highway here, and you get no compensation. And you still have to find somewhere to live. You're trying to live your life. You got kids, you got, mouths to feed, all of this stuff. And that's what happened. And to your point, Bailey, that this, yeah, well, I guess this is to Mayor Bynum's point as well about trying to fix something that happened in the past. There are still people alive that had this happen to them. This wasn't like in ancient Greece. This was up the street just 100 years ago, where you can still go and walk and see the damage that was done. The buildings, a couple of them are still there, still bearing the scars. The people are alive bearing the scars.
And Andy, when we think about generational wealth in this country and how people build opportunity, it's often from things that are passed down, right? The government and the white neighbors who participated in the destruction of Greenwood took that away from those Black residents. They didn't have that business to pass down because they had to shut down many of those businesses, right? They didn't have the land to then pass over to their kids so they can pass it to their kids because the lands were taken, right? You know what I'm saying? And so it does impact, like when people go to a Drillers game or, they're going to those different areas in downtown Tulsa, like they are benefiting from things that weren't reconciled 100 years ago, right? And so we have to have those reckonings in order to walk in truth. And it seems like we're not in a place where people can walk in truth because beyond the survivors, descendants could have, grown and moved ahead in life in different ways, and those opportunities were taken from them.
Yep. Yes. Man, let's come back to this more this summer.
We need to do like a whole month on this.
And hopefully, listeners, you are consuming some of the other information that is out there as well. Before we get into the budget discussion with Paul and Emma, a couple of things we wanted to hit that I mentioned last week that the plot has thickened, I suppose. One, not really a thick plot, but it's worth noting that the state chief operating officer, COO John Budd, officially resigned yesterday, 2 days ago, this week. He's been there since the beginning, so it's been almost the whole term. I know there's been lots of cabinet changes. That is not uncommon. It happens under governors of both parties. It's a hard job. Dear Lord, if you've been the state COO for the past year, you have aged like a decade, I think. I saw John a few weeks ago, and it has not been an easy road, right? Especially for a guy who's not overtly political and really is just like a good governance and like get shit done kind of guy. So he has left. He was the state's first COO. And I think even before state was elected, I was preaching the benefits of having a state COO, given the model in some other states. So we wish Mr. Budd the best. Related to that, well, not related. I just say nearby that, we mentioned last week that Attorney General Mike Hunter has resigned owing to some personal issues that were becoming public. And man, since then, he's had a rough go too. He resigned.
Well, there was a pending lawsuit against a cabinet member from Governor Stitt's cabinet.
That's right.
That right after the resignation suddenly became released, and now that person is suing former Attorney General Mike Hunter.
That's right. Yeah. So Secretary of Digital Transformation, David Ostro, yes, was under investigation for some kind of not libel, but like a conspiracy kind of thing. Not conspiracy. What's the word I'm looking for? He was it
was almost bribery kind of.
There we go, bribery, yes.
Yeah.
One of those crimes. So he was under investigation for bribery. And yeah, as soon as AG Hunter resigned, he basically rescinded that investigation or ended it. And so Ostro is suing him, saying this was inflammatory and derogatory. Also, Gittner Drummond, who I think gave Hunter a decent run for his money in the last election, has announced that he will be running again. And we still don't yet know who the governor is going to appoint as the interim AG.
Do you have my favorite music?
Oh, yes, I do. Right here.
You guys know what that means.
We're officially on Pruitt Watch.
This is an ongoing Pruitt Watch. I have not heard any rumors of Scott Pruitt being nominated to replace Mr. Hunter as AG. But, he's done the job before. He's no longer the EPA administrator. So, he could be looking for work. So I think we should just kind of have, in the absence of a specific breaking news story, I think we just need to have our Pruitt Watch music kind of constantly going in the background until we know who is or is not going to be the state's next attorney general.
Who knows, man? Who knows? Bailey is shaking her head at this, and Scott is grinning from ear to ear.
Well, and I think related to this conversation of who the governor would choose is a very critical time because of the decision made by our Supreme Court related to managed care and Medicaid. Because one concern that I have is that he may be looking for someone to fill in the role who's going to actively fight that Supreme Court decision or figure out a way to get around, because there's not a lot of understanding of what exactly it means to move forward on Medicaid expansion implementation policy. So we're still moving forward on Medicaid expansion, but when it comes to Medicaid expansion implementation, there's still a lot of questions in the air what it means. So will he replace the new AG with someone who's going to actively fight and figure out ways to maintain managed care to align with the law?
Yeah. So just for kind of review for our listeners, I'll make it real quick so we can get into the budget. And this kind of deals with the budget. So as we have talked about ad nauseum on the show, the governor had decided to pursue a managed care model for student care. Several folks in the state legislature were not happy about that. There was talk of trying to stop managed care altogether. There was no legislation to do that. However, there was a bill that was passed, SB 131, that codified and put into state statute a lot of what was in the contracts that the healthcare authority had signed with these out-of-state managed care companies. So that was kind of the landscape until this week when we got, I think it was on Tuesday, right? We got a Supreme Court decision handed down that said that the governor actually and the healthcare authority actually didn't have the legal authority to enter into those contracts and pursue managed care without the legislature having specifically granted them that authority. So what's interesting, though, is because now there are people saying, well, the legislature has since codified what was in the contracts and put those into statute. So does that action give the healthcare authority the ability to pursue managed care? Like, has the legislature now effectively ceded that authority? And I think that's an open question. I would say, not a lawyer, my perennial disclaimer, in dissent, Justice Winchester wrote that the legislature passed Senate Bill 131 entitled Ensuring Access to Medicaid Act, which recognizes a managed care model. So what that tells me from the outside looking in is that discussion of SB 131 was actually part of the thinking of the justices in this ruling. And so that would seem to lend itself to the idea that no, in this ruling, the justices were saying, no, SB 131 doesn't do that. And so the legislature would have to specifically grant authority to the healthcare authority to pursue managed care in the way that they were doing it before. They'd have to do it through a separate piece of legislation. Having the healthcare authority already having done that, I think is one thing. Trying to get the legislature to come back and give them the authority to do that, I think I could be wrong. I think might be a much heavier lift, particularly given how tough it was to get 131 across the finish line at the end of the legislative session. So,
and there's a lot of lawmakers who don't
do not like managed
the
care.
idea of the managed care model on our senior care program. So, and I think it would be a heavy lift if the legislature had to come back, after a really lengthy session, to then come back to a special session. I don't think they would be happy to do that already, but especially to come back and talk about something that they already don't like. I think that would be a challenge to move around.
Well, never underestimate the power of a special session.
That's
We'll
true.
see. Yeah, we'll see. I mean, we'll see what happens. As of today, 50,000 Oklahomans have signed up for Sooner Care. So you know what? It looks like Oklahomans actually do want and need this. Because it's only been a couple of days, and they're seeing record signups, which is outstanding. Very good news for the health of Oklahomans. Probably going to have an impact on the budget at some point, especially given all that tax relief that we just signed into law. As I always say, there's no relief like tax relief. I don't always say that. I just said it right now. So I is now, Andy, a good time to bring our guests in and delve into the particulars of the Oklahoma state budget?
I think it is, yes. Welcome to the show, Paul Shinn and Emma Morris from OK Policy. Hi, guys.
Hey there.
Thanks for joining us. Well, as we said earlier in the show, we've got a budget, we've got a deal. Everybody went home. Where did we end up?
Better than we started?
Well, that is not a phrase that we hear often with the state legislature.
Especially from someone like OK Policy. Yeah, I mean,
better what it could have been, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Better than it could have been, better than we thought it would be going into the session when we thought there could have to be budget cuts. And the big issue was, would they fund Medicaid expansion? There were not budget cuts. For a while, I'll be glass half full. There's significantly more money for education, K-12. There's significantly more money for mental health. A lot of programs that should impact criminal justice down the road. Lots of expansions besides Medicaid expansion in healthcare. There's a lot of good stuff in here. Equally important, and probably the least sexy thing I could talk about, a lot of state agencies have had their budgets cut 20, 30, 40% over the last 13, 14 years without even considering inflation. And a lot of them started to get it back this year. A lot of them, this is only in Oklahoma, would this be a victory? A lot of agencies are back to the budgets they had in 2015 and 2016. And, in places like the Water Resources Board, where, we're facing increasing issues with availability of water, conservation commission, where flooding is going to be a bigger problem, has been and is going to be. Environmental quality, those are, higher ed is back to where it was 5 years ago. So those are big deals. So that's good.
Hey, Paul, I'll just tell you, I'm always here for you on the non-sexy topics. Those are my favorite. I love it. This is the place for the non-sexy budget topics. So before I turn to the deeply pessimistic future, are there any more bright spots that you can point to?
Let's see. What am I forgetting?
I mean, we did get the EITC refundability has been restored. There's a caveat to that bright spot, though, because it was decoupled from the federal EITC, which means that if that is increased or each year as it's indexed for inflation, the Oklahoma State EITC will not do that anymore. So it will lose buying power each year. However, celebrate the wins. The refundability has been restored.
Can I ask a question about that? About the decoupling? So does it mean that the Oklahoma EITC is now like a specific dollar figure that is codified? Because it was 5% of what the federal EITC was.
So yeah, it's 5%. Correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, of the 2020 federal EITC. So rather than increasing each year, it will just always be 5% of whatever it was in 2020.
So I guess it really is indexed to it's not indexed. It is a specific number. It is that proportional value.
Yeah. So I'm not sure exactly how it'll work, but what it will mean for the 250,000 Oklahoma families that get the EI. Actually, it's more than that. It'll affect not just the ones who gain from refundability, but the ones who are already getting it fully refundable because they made a little bit more money. So it's 750,000 of Oklahomans, I think, get the EITC, kids and their parents. up until now, that would grow, their state EITC would grow a couple of percent every year because everything in the federal tax system is indexed for inflation. Now it won't. Now it will be, I guess it won't be a fixed amount of what you got in 2020, but it will be a fixed amount of what, it'll be a 5% of what you would get in tax year 2022 if the federal EITC was at the 2020 level. Does that make any sense?
It
Not
does. I
what
mean,
you
it's one of those things that like we're going to come up with the most complicated way possible to do something that should be really simple in order to try and save a little bit of money so we can give a tax break to somebody else that doesn't really need it. That's my
Yeah, I think you've got the basic concept there, Scott. And there's really two, you know, that 2 or 3% indexing, you know, 10 years of that, that compounds like interest as 10 years of that, the real value of your state EITC is, you know, barely half of what it is today. And then I'm pretty sure that the federal EITC will be increased next year more than just indexed. You know, that's something that is gonna happen even with the you know, split politics we have at the federal level. And every time that's happened before, back to 2000 when we got our state EITC, every time that's happened before, the Oklahoma state credit has gone up automatically as well. That's not going to happen again.
And I think it's worth noting that Oklahoma having it at 5% puts us in the top 10 lowest for state EITCs. Many states have theirs pegged to the federal rate, but at a much higher percentage, 25,
Yeah.
30, even 50%.
We're top three. We're bottom three. We're top three in the lowest. Louisiana and I think Montana and us. And yeah, there's our states that are now creeping over 50%. South Carolina actually has law. You know, South Carolina, the last bastion of liberalism, has it in law to get to 125% of the federal. So, you know, here in Oklahoma, you might be pulling down $300-400 as your state EITC. The South Carolina one will be a couple of thousand for the same family when they get to that level.
I heard that was a personal project of Senator Lindsey Graham to make that happen. That was his. That's been his life's work.
Good for him.
So, you know, Paul, as we're looking ahead, you know, so we did this thing where we cut the personal income tax rate by 0.25%. We're cutting our corporate income tax from 6% to 4%. I guess the hope is that 2% tax reduction in the corporate tax and the 0.25% lowering the income tax. I mean, should we expect an influx of millionaires and billionaires to Oklahoma in the next 12 months? Are we going to see like Amazon and Google moving their are they moving their headquarters to town? Are we going to see the next, you know, the electric car industry, the Ford F-150, Ford F-150 is going to be built in Oklahoma now because our tax rates are so great, and because of that, we're going to have just billions of dollars in the state treasury that we can use to fund everything imaginable? Or do you think it's more likely that, you know, in a couple of years we're going to be talking about $1 billion shortfall and we'll be having all those cuts to core services that you mentioned earlier? I'm 50-50. I don't know.
I think it's the first one, Scott, and also the national capital is going to come here because all those DC lobbyists want lower taxes than they pay in DC and Maryland. So yay for us. What do you think, Emma?
I think that, you know, corporations and individuals don't move places because of 0.25% less in the individual income tax rate. They move places because they have good schools, good roads, they can access their health care. And we have not proven that we value those things, at least at the state capitol in Oklahoma. So I think in order to actually attract people here, it's going to be way less about tax cuts and way more about how we're investing in Oklahomans.
Emma,
Yeah,
clearly you have never read Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman. You should go pick that up tonight and read it this weekend, and it'll change your mind.
I'm sure it will.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, and you know, the if you think about this historically, you know, this is not an isolated incident. Back in 1998, the state's top personal income tax rate was 7%. It's slowly been stepped down to 5%. You know, it's hard for me to see a huge economic boom from that, and to think that, you know, what 2%, 2 percentage points didn't accomplish, 1/4% doesn't. I mean, you know, that it's just wishful thinking. I mean, I really think cutting taxes to help the economy, pretty much disproven. Very few places that's made a difference. It's what I would call faith-based policy.
You know, it's interesting because it's one of those things. I'll stop being sarcastic now. It's one of those things that I guess I would say two things. So first, you know, people say all the time the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. In point of fact, that is not the definition of insanity. It's not even close. I think there's another word to describe doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. You know, I won't say it here for fear of calling anyone names, but it just blows my mind that, as you said, Paul, we've done this over and over and over again, and it never works. I will say that, you know, and I brought this up with Representative Eccles about a year ago, I think in kind of a more circuitous way. I think that you actually can get an economic boost from cutting taxes. I think that you can generate economic stimulus with tax cuts. The problem is when your taxes are already so low, it doesn't do anything, right? If Oklahoma had a tax rate of 18% and we dropped it to 10, that might do a lot, right? But we don't, right? Our taxes are already so low that when you drop it another 1/4%, it doesn't really make any difference. And it's just so frustrating to me that we have this political and economic ideology that sees there's really only one lever that the government can pull, and that just isn't true, right? If you want to have tax cuts as a vehicle that you can use to generate economic activity in times when there's a fiscal downturn, then when you have an economy that's juicing along and you got a surplus, you need to maybe save some money. You may even want to raise taxes in specific groups, raise taxes on upper income people where they're doing really, really well, so that you have that extra money to fund your services. And then when you need wealthy people to spend more, you can cut their taxes. And it's this both and, right? People say that liberals always want to raise taxes and conservatives always want to lower them. I don't know that that's always true, but what seems to be true is that you actually, good economic policy actually involves both, and doing the right one at the right time. Now, all of this is completely ignoring the idea, which I think is in question, that government has a super measurable impact on the economy anyway. It's just so frustrating.
But Scott, I think you're making an assumption, though, that we're making policy based on economic outcomes. And to the point you're raising, I think cutting the corporate income tax by 1/4% sounds really good on a mailer, right? It sounds really good to say we're giving the people more of their money back. Right? We know that the economic impact is not going to bring Oklahomans billions of dollars tomorrow, but it's something that sounds good to the voters. And so I hope that we do get to a point where we're governing by the future and what makes sense for building the environments that Emma described, right? Having schools that have all the things that they need for kids to thrive, roads that, don't have potholes in them, healthcare systems where everyone feels like they can get quality healthcare versus what will sound good in the next election cycle, or something that's going to help me move on to build supporters for my ideological beliefs, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, all of those things, as well as a tax system that doesn't tax people into poverty while simultaneously, handing millions of tax dollars to, people I won't name, Google, Paycom, Heartland, oil companies, the corporate tax cut that is largely taking hard-earned Oklahomans' money and moving it out of state, because that's where corporate headquarters are and where stockholders are and where most of the employees are. Target, I suppose, will make a pretty decent amount of money with that cut from 6 to 4%, but they're not going to use that to lower prices in Oklahoma or to raise pay for Oklahoma workers,
or to bring their headquarters to Oklahoma.
Exactly. All it's going to do is, that'll crank up the worldwide Target dividend by some part of a penny every quarter.
I mean, what's his Bezos? He needs a bigger yacht.
I'm worried about
only
him.
spending $500 million on this yacht, and as Scott I think said 2 weeks ago, his yacht has its own yacht to serve as its tender ship. I'm worried about the tender ship's yacht. Someone needs to care for that yacht.
Bezos is building his own private fleet. It just, we just hear all this time, hear all the time, the government needs to manage its finances and live within its means, just like, Oklahoman or American families do all the time. And I'm just like, when's the last time you went to your boss and were like, hey, could you cut my pay by 10% every month? I've just got I got a little too much extra. So you go ahead and keep it. And I'll just, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, cutting taxes at a time where the economy is what would appear to be a nice, decent upturn that's going to last a year or 2 or 3 years. That's like saying, I'm gonna go ahead and give up my second job and do it in a way that they will never hire me back, no matter how desperate I am. Sure, that makes sense now, but it doesn't make sense into the future. And Scott, what you mentioned is all of the tax cuts, and we haven't even talked about the incentives for specific businesses. That adds up to like $500 million when it's fully phased in. $500 million smaller budget, and that's for 5-6% of our total budget. And we're going to want that someday, 2-3 years from now, when we're all saying, wringing our hands about, oh gosh, we have to cut education and fewer teachers and et cetera. We're going to wonder, would we have not been better off? Because it's so hard to raise those taxes back. It's politically difficult, forgetting the, mechanics of State Question 640 and supermajority requirements and stuff. That money is not coming back ever, unless we are in such desperate straits like we were just 5 years ago. And even then, it doesn't come back fully. We're on a continuous roller coaster, and roller coasters never get back to the highest hill.
And that's a 25-year effort, right? To even get to a place where we could raise the taxes somewhat. So
5 years of real total deterioration in our public services.
And we haven't even talked about the fact that this, you mentioned at the outset, Paul, that the budget was actually in a much better place than we thought it was going to be, which is 100% true. I think it's also 100% true that a big part of that is because of one-time federal funds that aren't going to be there next year, right? Yep. Like, we cut taxes because of one-time funds that we're not going to have next year. So even if the economy is still, juicing along or has recovered further in the next 12 to 24 months, I hope it's recovered enough that we can get all this money back that we're not going to be getting from Washington.
Yeah, I mean, we're on a sugar high from checks from Washington, and when we come down, it's not going to feel good.
And it's interesting also to think about what they're willing to use that one-time funding for. They've been unwilling to do, like, to invest in the well-being of everyday Oklahomans. But are willing to use it for certain other things. So we just have to remember that, like we've all said, the budget is a moral document, and that's showing, what we're valuing as Oklahomans.
100%. And not only is the budget a moral document, but it's a document that tells us, like, it should, in a perfect world, it should tell us what are the things that we need to be able to get the services at the levels that meet need. And I don't think we talk about the budget nor the revenues that we bring in those ways often enough. I think, okay, policy is leading the way in having those conversations, but as a state, we have to talk about what does it take to get us to the education system that has all the things that it needs to be able to help every school be an A school or a thriving school? Or what does it take to, fund agencies to be able to do the work in the ways that lift their missions, and not just this one budget year, we gave them more money than last year, because just because you have more money this year than you did last year doesn't mean that you have all the money you need to do all the things you need to do. And so even when we're talking about our own like personal budgets as like individual people, my budget this year, may be bigger, but it doesn't mean that I got all the things that I needed to be able to survive in the ways that I do. So I think that's just an important piece that we have to continue to push on the conversation on revenue, but even what does the budget mean?
Yeah, you have to go back to why we have government. There are things that didn't work out that well when we didn't. Murder going unchecked was only one of the things. I mean, shall we ask Jeff Bezos to pay for all of our highways so Amazon trucks can make deliveries? Should we make Target pay for streets and for the airports? And, it doesn't work. There's no one of us that can do the things that we need, build schools, build roads. And if you think about what made this country, it's not Amazon. It's having a highway system. It's having an airport system. It's having public schools. The one thing that makes America truly unique is centuries of experience with good public schools. And people would like you to believe we don't have those anymore because that fits the narrative of cutting them and funding private schools. But that's not true. I mean, we still have an education system that is the real foundation of the future of Oklahoma and America. And we need to stop treating it like it's a burden.
Paul,
it's a treasure.
I'm gonna kindly ask you to keep that socialist nonsense to yourself in the future. Oh.
Exactly. Well,
don't even get me started. I haven't got to socialist yet.
Next week on Let's Pod This, Socialism with Paul.
This is fun.
To Bailey's point earlier about our personal budget. So, as the listeners probably know, my mother and my grandmother both passed away about 6 months ago, and I inherited a small amount of money from my grandma. And we had the same debate that the state had, right? Do we invest in infrastructure and do some repairs on our house and get it painted? Or do we go blow it all at the casino or on a vacation or, buy something frivolous? And I will say, I understand the appeal of doing the thing that looks good on the mailer. However, we all know the value and the buyer's remorse you have when you do that, right? Which is why we're getting the house painted instead. So, all right. Well, Paul and Emma, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us. Good
and
chat.
You can talk about socialism anytime.
That's true.
We'll have more to talk about then.
That's right. All right, listeners, thanks for being here. Scott, Bailey, thank you for being here as well.
Thank you, Andy.
All right, listeners, hopefully the next week will not be quite as exciting as the last two, but over the summer, we're going to take some time to keep you updated on the current events of our state government, but also to maybe do a little deeper dive into some of the issues we talked about today, things like the budget, like education funding, like what's going to happen with the Attorney General's office. And remember that all of this stuff happens in our state and you have a voice in it, right? You have thoughts and feelings about the state budget. Have you talked to your state legislators about it? Like, do they know what you think we should invest in? Because they should be making decisions based on what their constituents say. And if you don't show up, they don't know. So take this off season to send them an email. They're not in session. Invite them to coffee, grab a drink, something, and have that conversation with them so that when they come back for special session in the fall, maybe we don't get hosed. Okay. On that note, everybody have a good weekend.